My name is Mila Halloway. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my professional life, I have been described with words like steady, dependable, and sometimes, quietly, harmless. I've worked in corporate operations for over a decade, the kind of role where you make systems run smoothly, solve problems before they become visible, and rarely receive credit because nothing appears broken. If you met me at work, you probably wouldn't notice me first. I don't dominate meetings. I don't interrupt. I don't raise my voice to win arguments. I take notes. I ask precise questions. I remember what people said 6 months ago. I document details most people forget. And because of that calm, because of that restraint, people often assume something about me. They assume I won't push back. They assume I'll absorb discomfort quietly. They assume that if pressure is applied slowly enough, I'll eventually bend. This story is about the moment someone tested that assumption too far. It's about the day my manager tried to force me to resign. Not with shouting, not with threats, but with subtle meetings, carefully worded emails, and a narrative crafted to make me feel like I was the problem. And it's about what I chose to do instead. This isn't a revenge story. There's no dramatic confrontation in a crowded office. No explosive speeches, no humiliation. What happened was quieter than that. I documented every conversation, every shifting expectation, every contradictory instruction. I saved emails, I kept timelines, I wrote down dates and witnesses, not because I was planning a fight, but because something inside me shifted from confusion to clarity. And when the pressure escalated, when the message became clear that my resignation would be the easiest solution, I didn't argue. I didn't panic. I filed for constructive dismissal. Legal stepped in before he could finish the paperwork. The emotional journey of this story isn't about anger. It's about recognition. It's about what happens when someone who has always chosen patience realizes that patience without boundaries becomes permission. You'll hear how the small cuts began, how disrespect becomes normalized, how silence can transform from survival into strategy, and how sometimes the most powerful move you can make is not louder, it's documented. If you've ever felt underestimated at work, if you've ever wondered whether you were too sensitive or imagining things, and if you've ever stayed quiet longer than you should have, I want you to know this isn't about dramatic justice. It's about measured response, about understanding your leverage before anyone else realizes you have it. And before we go further, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever been treated as if your calm meant you wouldn't defend yourself? In the office, I was solid. That was the word they used. Solid, reliable, calm under pressure. No one ever said essential. No one ever said strategic. And certainly no one ever said dangerous. I worked as a senior operations coordinator at a mid-sized financial services firm in Manchester. It was the kind of place that liked to call itself agile, but still ran on rigid hierarchies and unspoken alliances. My job was to make sure departments spoke to each other without friction. Compliance to sales, finance to customer services, management to the actual people doing the work. If something went wrong, it usually passed through my inbox first, and if it was fixed quickly, it looked like nothing had ever happened. That invisibility became my brand. To them, I was the woman who stayed late without announcing it, the one who summarized meetings that no one else wanted to take notes on, the one who remembered the regulatory deadlines before compliance sent reminders. When systems were audited, my folders were pristine. When clients complained, I had timestamps. When directors forgot what they'd approved, I had meeting minutes. But none of that felt threatening to anyone because I never held authority. I didn't fight for the spotlight. I didn't correct people publicly. If someone interrupted me mid-sentence, I'd pause, let them finish, and continue in a slightly softer tone. And that softness created a myth that I didn't mind. It wasn't that I was invisible. It was that I was predictable. I would fix things. I would smooth tension. I would absorb stress. And I would never push back hard enough to make anyone uncomfortable. I became the person people felt safe overlooking. At performance reviews, my manager, Daniel, would smile in that professionally encouraging way and say things like, "You're such a stabilizing presence, Mila." Stabilizing. It sounded like praise. And maybe it was. But stabilizing forces don't get promoted. They get leaned on. In meetings, I'd watch colleagues speak confidently about projects I had structured behind the scenes. I'd see my process documents rebranded as team initiatives. Sometimes my name was mentioned, often it wasn't. And here's the truth. I didn't resent it at first. I told myself I preferred quiet contribution. I told myself that recognition wasn't everything. I told myself that leadership noticed consistency even if it wasn't loud. There's a certain power in being underestimated. At least that's what I believed. What I didn't realize was that underestimation can slowly transform into something else. Permission. Permission to speak over you. Permission to assign you the tasks no one wants. Permission to assume you'll accept decisions already made. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. But at the time, it felt normal. It felt like the natural consequence of being the easy employee. I rarely said no. If a deadline shifted at the last minute, I reorganized my schedule. If another department missed something critical, I quietly corrected it before it escalated. If Daniel forgot to include me in a planning email about a process I built, I'd forward the relevant documentation without commentary. He once joked in a meeting, "Mila will sort it. She always does." Everyone laughed lightly. I smiled too. That smile is important because it reinforced the narrative that I was comfortable where I stood, somewhere between administrative support and operational backbone. Necessary, but not central. I wasn't in the power circle. I wasn't part of the informal lunches where future restructures were hinted at. I wasn't asked for strategic input, only execution support. To them, I was the dependable middle, not ambitious enough to challenge, not fragile enough to protect, not loud enough to notice, and perhaps most importantly, not confrontational enough to fear. What they didn't understand was that calm doesn't mean unaware. I noticed who got invited to which meetings. I noticed how credit moved upward. I noticed that when my responsibilities expanded without a title adjustment. But I told myself it was temporary. Growth required patience. Loyalty would be rewarded. Stability would be recognized. I believed in systems. I believed that if I kept performing at a high level, structure would eventually align with merit. What I hadn't accounted for was a different kind of system, one that relies not on competence, but on convenience. And I was very convenient. Convenient employees don't disrupt. They adapt until something changes. At that stage, though, I was still exactly who they thought I was. Solid, predictable, quiet. The kind of woman no one worries about pushing a little too far. The first moment didn't feel significant. That's important. If it had been dramatic, a public reprimand, a raised voice, a clear accusation, I would have recognized it immediately. I would have reacted, documented it instinctively, maybe even escalated it. But this wasn't sharp. It was subtle. It happened during a Monday morning operations review, the kind of meeting where everyone half listens while scrolling through spreadsheets. Daniel was presenting a revised workflow structure, one that looked strangely familiar, because it was. 3 weeks earlier, I had drafted a process improvement proposal to reduce compliance backlogs. I'd sent it to him directly, asking for feedback before sharing it more widely. He'd responded with a short, "Looks promising, let's discuss." We never did. So when I saw the slide on the screen, my formatting, my structure, even my phrasing, reframed as a management-led efficiency initiative, I felt something small tighten in my chest. I waited. I assumed he would mention that I had built the framework. A simple line would have sufficed. Mila worked on the foundation of this. He didn't. The room nodded appreciatively. One of the directors said, "This is exactly the kind of proactive thinking we need." Daniel smiled modestly. I sat there with my notebook open, pen resting between my fingers, perfectly still. It wasn't the lack of credit that unsettled me. I'd grown accustomed to that. It was the ease of it, the seamlessness, the way no one in the room even glanced in my direction, despite knowing I handled the operational groundwork for nearly every cross-department process. It felt rehearsed, not malicious, just comfortable. After the meeting, one colleague stopped by my desk and said, "Good that Daniel's finally pushing some structural improvements." Finally, I smiled. Yes, it's a positive step. And in that moment, I made my first rationalization. It doesn't matter who presents it, I told myself. The system benefits either way. That was the first small cut, not the presentation itself, but my decision to swallow the discomfort. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me into his office. He shut the door gently. He had that tone managers use when they want to sound collaborative. "I need you to backfill some additional reporting for the next quarter," he said. "Since you're already familiar with the workflow redesign, it makes sense." I blinked once. Additional reporting? Yes. Metrics tracking, cross-team accountability logs, and monthly compliance summaries. It'll sit under your remit for now. For now, let's see how it evolves. The words were harmless. The request was framed as logical. But the workload expansion was significant. At least 5 to 7 extra hours a week. I asked carefully, "Will the scope adjustment be reflected in the title or compensation review?" He smiled, not dismissively, but vaguely. "Let's focus on delivering value first. These things naturally align over time." Naturally align. That phrase stayed with me, because I had delivered value for years, and alignment had not naturally occurred. Still, I nodded. Understood. He seemed pleased by the lack of resistance. As I walked back to my desk, I didn't feel angry. I felt recalibrated. Something had shifted, though I couldn't name it yet. That evening, instead of closing my notebook and heading home immediately, I opened a new page. I wrote the date. I wrote the meeting summary. I wrote the additional responsibilities assigned. I wrote the phrase, "Will align naturally." Not in accusation, not in resentment, just as a record. At the time, I didn't consciously think, I'm preparing for something. I simply wanted clarity, a clean memory, a timeline that didn't depend on emotion. The strange thing about subtle disrespect is that it rarely feels outrageous in isolation. It feels explainable. He forgot to mention you. He assumed you'd handle it. He believes in your competence. That's how it begins, not with hostility, but with quiet reallocation of credit and quiet expansion of expectation. And the world around you treats it as normal. No one gasped. No one questioned, except me, and I began noticing more carefully after that. If the first small cut had been an accident, I might have forgotten it. But it wasn't an accident. It became a rhythm. Over the next 2 months, the pattern deepened in ways that were almost too subtle to protest without sounding dramatic. Deadlines would shift, but only for my deliverables. In meetings, Daniel began pre-answering questions directed at me, not contradicting me, just overriding the space before I could speak. We've already considered that, he'd say smoothly, before I could finish outlining a risk mitigation step I had personally drafted. At first, I told myself it was efficiency. He's a senior. He's protecting the timeline. He's translating for the room. But there's a specific sensation when someone consistently steps half a second ahead of your voice. It doesn't feel collaborative. It feels diminishing. And what made it more complex was that he was never openly rude. He'd thank me for my support. He'd call me integral in one-on-one meetings. He'd reassure me that he trusted my judgment. But in public spaces, that trust didn't manifest as visibility. It manifested as silence. One afternoon, I was preparing a compliance impact report for an upcoming audit. It was detailed, 70 pages of process mapping and regulatory alignment, the kind of work that requires precision and institutional memory. Daniel asked for a draft to review. 2 days later, he forwarded the document, with minor edits, directly to the executive team. No introduction, no acknowledgement of authorship. Just please find attached. One of the directors replied, "Excellent clarity. Thank you." Thank you. Not Mila, not the operations team, just him. I stared at the email for a full minute before closing it. And here's where normalization begins. I didn't confront him. Instead, I rationalized. It's his role to present upward. This is how hierarchy works. My value isn't reduced by his visibility. I was very good at intellectualizing discomfort, but my body knew before my mind did. I began waking up earlier, not because I needed to, but because my mind felt alert before dawn. I replayed conversations in silence. I rewrote responses I hadn't given. And yet, during the day, I remained steady, efficient, calm. There was one particular meeting that crystallized the pattern. We were discussing resource allocation for Q3. I had data demonstrating that our team was operating 18% over capacity. I presented the numbers clearly, projections, risk assessments, and potential burnout metrics. Daniel listened, nodded thoughtfully, and then said, "While the numbers are useful, I think we can stretch a bit further before considering additional headcount." Stretch, as if capacity were elastic, as if fatigue were theoretical. I responded carefully. The stretch may increase audit exposure. He smiled in that controlled, reassuring way. Let's not catastrophize. We'll manage. We'll manage. Translation, you'll manage. After the meeting, one colleague whispered, "You're always so composed. I don't know how you stay so calm." I almost laughed, because calm wasn't easy. Calm was containment. That night, instead of closing my notebook with a single summary, I created a structured log. Date, meeting, assigned responsibilities, language used, witnesses present. I began capturing exact phrases. We'll align naturally. Let's not catastrophize. We'll manage. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were consistent. Patterns only become undeniable when they're documented. And something inside me was starting to resist the normalization. The truth is, disrespect becomes sustainable when it's subtle enough that you doubt your interpretation. Was I being sidelined? Or was I overreacting? Was credit shifting? Or was this standard managerial presentation? Was my workload unreasonable? Or was this simply growth? That internal questioning kept me quiet longer than anything else. Because I've always believed in fairness, in due process, in a measured response. And accusing someone of undermining you without irrefutable clarity felt irresponsible. So I didn't accuse, I observed. I adjusted. I listened more closely. And without announcing it to anyone, even to myself, I stopped assuming this was temporary. I started preparing for the possibility that it wasn't. It wasn't written anywhere. No formal document outlined it. No one explicitly said it out loud. But slowly, unmistakably, a role had been assigned to me. Reliable, useful, invisible. I began to see it in the way tasks were distributed. When a new cross-functional project was launched, I wasn't invited to the planning discussion. I was invited afterward to operationalize whatever had already been decided. When tension rose between departments, I was asked to mediate quietly, off the record, so leadership didn't have to step in visibly. When something failed, I was looped in to repair it, but rarely included in the debrief where lessons were extracted and credit redistributed. I wasn't being excluded entirely. That would have been obvious. I was being positioned as the steady middle layer, the buffer, the absorber of friction. It's a powerful role, but only when chosen. When assigned without consent, it becomes containment. I remember one specific afternoon when the realization settled fully. Daniel had scheduled a one-on-one. On the surface, it was a routine performance check-in. He began with praise. "You're the backbone of this department, Mila." Backbone. It sounded strong, structural, essential. But backbones don't make decisions. They support those who do. "I see you as someone who keeps everything steady," he continued. "And that stability is valuable. Not everyone needs to be front-facing." There it was. Not everyone needs to be front-facing. It was framed as reassurance, as if he were protecting me from unnecessary visibility. But beneath it was an assumption that I didn't aspire to more, that I was most comfortable in support, that I didn't mind being unseen. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked evenly, what would the pathway look like if I wanted to move into strategic leadership? There was a slight pause, almost imperceptible. "Well," he said carefully, "leadership requires a certain presence, a level of assertiveness that isn't naturally your style. But that's not a criticism, it's just different strengths." Different strengths. I understood the translation. "Stay where you are." I nodded as if I were processing helpful feedback. I thanked him for the clarity. I left the office with measured composure, but something inside me hardened. Not with anger, but with definition. They had decided who I was. Not maliciously, not cruelly. Conveniently, I was the calm one. The stabilizer, the woman who didn't disrupt the hierarchy. And because I had never loudly demanded recognition, they assumed I didn't require it. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being consistently interpreted through a narrow lens. Every quiet strength becomes passivity. Every restraint becomes a lack of ambition. Every measured tone becomes an absence of authority. And the most dangerous part? I had participated in shaping that perception. I had smiled. I had accepted an expanded scope without renegotiation. I had corrected misattributed work silently. I had allowed the role to solidify because confrontation felt excessive. But clarity changes tolerance. That week, I noticed something else. Decisions affecting my workload were being made without my presence. Yet I was still expected to execute them flawlessly. Timelines shortened without consultation. Resources are reduced without warning. Expectations elevated without adjustment. It wasn't oversight. It was structural. I was being positioned as execution only. And in a restructuring heavy corporate environment, execution only roles are the easiest to reframe, the easiest to consolidate, the easiest to question. That thought lingered longer than I wanted it to. Because once you see the frame someone places you in, you can't unsee it. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't challenge the feedback directly. Instead, I adjusted my internal posture. If they saw me as the quiet backbone, I would become something else quietly. Not louder, more precise, more observant, more documented. Because roles assigned without consent can be rewritten, but not through emotion, through structure. And for the first time, I stopped trying to fit the role comfortably. I began studying it. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during an argument. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 8:17 a.m., alone at my desk. I remember the time because I wrote it down later. An email from Daniel appeared in my inbox with the subject line, "Performance Alignment Discussion." The phrasing felt corporate, neutral, harmless. Inside, the tone was careful. He wrote that there had been recent concerns about my adaptability to evolving leadership expectations. He suggested we schedule a formal review conversation later that week. I read it once, then again. Recent concerns. No examples listed, no context, just ambiguity. And something inside me went very still. Not anxious, not panicked. Still, I opened my sent folder and searched for the last 3 months of correspondence. I reviewed project timelines. I looked at performance metrics, audit feedback, director responses, capacity reports. There were no warnings, no informal coaching conversations, no documented performance gaps. In fact, only 2 weeks earlier, Daniel had described me as integral to operational continuity. The contrast was too clean. That was the moment I stopped viewing this as interpersonal tension. It became a structural risk. If recent concerns existed without documentation, they could be constructed retroactively. If adaptability were undefined, it could mean anything. And if a formal review was initiated without prior informal correction, the outcome might already be designed. I didn't react immediately. Instead, I opened my notebook, the slim black leather one I carried into every meeting, and wrote 8:17 a.m., performance alignment discussion email received. No prior written concerns. Then I drew a line underneath it. That line felt symbolic, though I couldn't fully articulate why. Up until that morning, I had been tolerating incremental diminishment, observing it, rationalizing it. But this was different. This wasn't about credit. This wasn't about workload. This was about narrative. And narratives, once formalized in HR language, can become self-fulfilling. I sat there for several minutes without typing a reply. I noticed something surprising. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even angry. I felt clear. Clear in a way that only comes when ambiguity dissolves. For months, I had questioned whether I was overinterpreting subtle patterns, whether my discomfort was sensitivity rather than a signal. That email removed doubt. If performance was suddenly under review without a documented foundation, then the process itself needed to be documented. I replied calmly. Thank you for the update, Daniel. I'm happy to discuss. For clarity, could you please provide specific examples of the recent concerns you mentioned so I can prepare constructively? Professional, neutral, unemotional. He responded 3 hours later. Let's discuss live. No examples? That was confirmation. That afternoon, I reviewed the employee handbook, the grievance procedure, the performance management policy, the section on progressive feedback requirements. I wasn't looking for conflict. I was looking for alignment between process and action. And I noticed something else. Our company prided itself on regulatory compliance. We were meticulous with client documentation, transparent with financial reporting, but internal management practices were softer, more flexible. Flexible systems benefit those with positional power, unless someone understands the framework better than they expect. That day, something subtle shifted in my posture. Not externally, no one would have noticed. But internally, I stopped trying to preserve the relationship. I began preserving the record. There's a difference. Preserving the relationship requires smoothing tension, interpreting charitably, and maintaining comfort. Preserving the record requires neutrality, precision, and distance. By the time I left the office that evening, I had created a private digital folder. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't labeled aggressively, just dated. Inside, I saved emails, performance reviews, project metrics, meeting summaries. Not because I had decided to escalate, but because for the first time, I accepted a quiet possibility. This might not be about development. It might be about displacement. And if someone was preparing to redefine my performance, I needed to ensure that definition wasn't one-sided. The shift wasn't anger. It was recognition. I had been assigned a role. Now, I was choosing my own. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m., 2 full days after the email. Enough time to create tension. Enough time to make someone second-guess themselves. But I didn't spend those 2 days spiraling. I spent them organizing. By the time I walked into Daniel's office, I wasn't defensive. I wasn't pleading for clarity. I was prepared. He began the conversation in the same measured tone he always used. This isn't disciplinary, he said first. It's developmental. That sentence is almost always a prelude. He spoke about perception gaps, about the need for greater visibility in leadership dynamics, about feedback suggesting I wasn't projecting enough ownership. Projecting ownership. I let him finish. Then I asked calmly, can you share specific instances where ownership appeared insufficient? He hesitated as thighs. Was this finally? Well, it's more about overall presence. Understood, I said. Is there documented feedback from stakeholders reflecting this concern? Another pause. It's more informal at this stage. Informal. I nodded slowly and took a note in my notebook. The sound of pen on paper in a quiet office is subtle, but it changes the air. He noticed. You don't need to document everything, he said lightly, almost joking. I prefer clarity, I replied gently. It helps me improve. That was the moment silence became a choice. For months, I had used silence to absorb, to smooth, to avoid unnecessary friction. Now I was using silence strategically. I didn't argue his points. I didn't defend myself emotionally. I didn't list achievements or challenge the ambiguity. I asked for specifics. I requested examples. I referenced policy language neutrally. Every time he spoke in generalities, I responded with structure. By the end of the meeting, he had offered no concrete deficiencies, only impressions. Impressions are difficult to dispute, but they are also difficult to formalize without evidence. Afterward, I sent a follow-up email summarizing our discussion. Thank you for the conversation today. To confirm my understanding, the areas for development relate to perceived visibility and ownership projection, without specific documented performance gaps at this stage. Please let me know if I have misunderstood. It was concise, respectful, clear. He responded with a short acknowledgement. That email mattered, because silence without record is submission. Silence with record is positioning. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something else. Daniel began including HR more frequently in performance-related communications. Casual check-ins turned into calendar-invited touchpoints. Language shifted from conversational to procedural. Most people might have panicked. I didn't. Instead, I adjusted how I moved. When deadlines were assigned, I asked for confirmation in writing. When the scope expanded, I replied with capacity impact summaries. When feedback was vague, I asked for metrics. Not aggressively, consistently. And the more structured I became, the more cautious he appeared. He still spoke confidently in meetings, still presented himself as decisive. But in one-on-ones, there was a new edge, subtle, restrained, as if he were testing how far he could press without leaving fingerprints. What he didn't realize was that the more he pressed, the more comprehensive my documentation became. Not just emails, dates, witnesses, comparative workload analysis. historical performance reviews with contrasting praise. I wasn't building a case emotionally. I was building a timeline. And here's the irony. Externally, I appeared more compliant than ever. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't escalate to HR first. I didn't confront him publicly. To most observers, I was still the steady backbone. But internally, something had recalibrated completely. I was no longer trying to prove my value within his narrative. I was preparing for the possibility that his narrative might become hostile. Silence, when misunderstood, looks like weakness. Silence, when chosen, is observation. And observation is leverage. The atmosphere in the office grew subtly tense. Nothing overt. No accusations. Just a quiet recalculation happening on both sides. He believed he was guiding a development process. I knew I was mapping a pattern. Neither of us said it aloud. But the ground had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like someone is arriving on time, answering emails promptly, attending meetings with the same calm expression they've always worn. That's what no one noticed. While Daniel adjusted language and slowly increased procedural pressure, I expanded my preparation in ways that were invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. The first thing I did was audit my own history. Not emotionally, structurally. I pulled every performance review from the past 5 years. I created a side-by-side comparison chart of the language used. Exceptional attention to detail, critical to operational stability, trusted cross-functional leader, consistently exceeds expectations. Then I compared that to the new phrases emerging: perception gap, visibility concerns, leadership presence development. The shift wasn't gradual, it was abrupt. And abrupt narrative shifts without documented behavioral change create risk, not for the employee, but for the employer. I didn't share that realization with anyone. Instead, I began studying policy more closely. Our company handbook outlined progressive performance management steps: informal feedback, documented improvement plan, measurable targets, review period, and reassessment. None of that had formally begun, yet the tone suggested escalation. I scheduled a private consultation with an external employment solicitor, not to file anything, just to ask questions. I described the pattern neutrally. I shared emails. I summarized conversations. He listened quietly and then asked, "Have they provided written evidence of underperformance?" "No." "Have your duties expanded?" "Yes." "Have you been excluded from strategic meetings related to your role?" "Yes." He paused. "Document everything," he said, "especially any pressure to resign or any suggestion that leaving would be easier. That language matters." That sentence settled deeply, because until then, I hadn't considered resignation as part of their strategy. I thought it was about control or repositioning. But displacement often comes wrapped in suggestion. I left that consultation not angry, just informed. From that point forward, I became meticulous in ways that would have seemed excessive to anyone else. When Daniel requested a last-minute deliverable, I responded with, "Happy to assist. To ensure alignment, could you confirm this takes priority over X and Y tasks previously assigned?" When expectations changed midstream, I asked, "For clarity, is this a revised objective from our discussion on date?" Every sentence was courteous. Every question is anchored to a record. I also began quietly rebuilding external leverage. I updated my CV, not because I intended to leave immediately, but because clarity requires optionality. I reconnected with 2 former colleagues who had moved into leadership roles elsewhere. Not to complain, just to maintain network lines. Inside the office, I remained composed, but something else was happening that they never noticed. I stopped volunteering for invisible labor, not abruptly, not defensively. But when asked to take meeting minutes for executive sessions, a task I had defaulted into for years, I responded, "I believe this falls outside my current scope. Perhaps we can rotate responsibility." The room adjusted slightly. It was subtle, but roles begin to loosen when you stop reinforcing them. Daniel seemed mildly surprised the first time I declined an extra task without justification beyond scope alignment. He didn't push back strongly, but I saw something flicker, recalculation. Meanwhile, I was building a chronological file that now spanned months. Emails, calendar invites, policy excerpts, contradictory feedback, workload comparisons with peers at similar levels. Patterns only appear undeniable when viewed in sequence. And sequence was my specialty. What they never noticed was that my calm had evolved. It was no longer the calm of someone hoping to be recognized. It was the calm of someone preparing for structural resolution. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't hoping he would slip dramatically. I was waiting for clarity. And clarity, in systems that rely on quiet pressure, often arrives when pressure escalates. It always does. And when it did, I would be ready. The suggestion came on a Friday afternoon. It was almost predictable in its timing. Late week, lower staff presence, a calendar invite marked quick catch-up, no agenda. I walked into Daniel's office with my notebook in hand, as always. He didn't comment on it anymore. He closed the door gently. "I've been thinking about our recent conversations. he began, tone soft, almost sympathetic. And I wonder if we should explore options that might feel less pressured for you. Less pressured. I didn't respond immediately. He continued. Sometimes roles evolve, expectations shift, and it's not about performance, it's about fit. I'd hate for you to feel stuck somewhere that isn't aligned with your strengths. Fit, alignment, strengths. It was elegant language, non-accusatory, almost caring. Then it came. There may be scope for an amicable exit package if you felt that transitioning out would be better long-term. There it was. Not a threat, not a dismissal, a suggestion. Resignation framed as an opportunity. The room was very quiet after he said it. I looked at him evenly. Are you suggesting that my position is at risk? I asked. No, he replied quickly. Not at all. I'm suggesting we think proactively. Proactively? Has a formal performance process been initiated? I asked. No. Have I failed to meet documented objectives? No, but... Then to clarify, I said calmly, this conversation is exploratory. He hesitated. Yes, exploratory. I wrote the word down. Exploratory. What he didn't realize was that this conversation, framed gently, was the reveal. Not because he offered an exit, but because he offered it without foundation. Constructive dismissal isn't about shouting or sudden termination. It's about creating an environment where continued employment becomes untenable through pressure, ambiguity, or implied threat. Until that moment, I had been observing patterns. Now I understand the trajectory. If I declined the amicable exit, the performance narrative would likely solidify. Documentation would be built retroactively. A formal improvement plan might follow, vague, subjective, and difficult to pass. If I accepted, the company would avoid a formal dispute. Either way, the direction was no longer neutral. I nodded slowly. I appreciate you sharing that, I said. I'll need time to consider any proposal formally. If there are written terms, I'd prefer to review them. He seemed slightly unsettled by the word formally. We're just discussing possibilities, he reminded me. Of course, I replied. The meeting ended politely. I walked back to my desk without a visible change in pace, but internally, the picture had crystallized completely. That evening, I updated my file. Date, Dai's exact phrasing, offer of amicable exit, absence of formal performance documentation. Then I wrote one sentence at the bottom. Pressure implied without a procedural basis. I didn't celebrate this realization. There was no satisfaction, only clarity, because clarity means decision. I contacted the employment solicitor again and outlined the conversation precisely. He responded with measured interest. If you can demonstrate a pattern of undermining, role diminution, ambiguous performance pressure, and suggestion of resignation without formal grounds, as he said, that can support a claim of constructive dismissal. But it requires careful handling. Careful handling. That's when I understood my leverage fully. Not emotional leverage, procedural leverage. They believed I was the steady, compliant employee who would prefer a quiet exit over conflict. They believed I valued comfort more than structure. They believed I would interpret the suggestion as guidance. What they didn't realize was that I value process, and process when misused leads to postcards. The private reveal wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, a door is closing gently, a suggestion wrapped in concern, and the recognition that the narrative being built around me could now be challenged, not with confrontation, but with law. I didn't feel powerful. I felt resolved, because once you see the architecture of pressure, you stop internalizing it. You respond to it, and I was ready to choose how. Once clarity arrives, indecision becomes a choice. That weekend, I didn't talk to friends about it. I didn't dramatize the situation in my head. I didn't rehearse speeches or imagine confrontations. I laid out options. Option 1, accept the amicable exit. Negotiate quietly, leave with a reference and financial cushion. Protect my energy, avoid conflict. Option 2, stay, comply, attempt to improve perception, and hope the narrative softens. Risk prolonged ambiguity. Risk formal performance action later. Option 3, continue documenting, decline resignation suggestion, and if pressure escalates or position becomes untenable, file for constructive dismissal. Each option had consequences. The first offered immediate relief, but validated a narrative that I had failed to fit. The second prolonged uncertainty handed control entirely to him. The third was the most irreversible. Constructive dismissal is not impulsive. It requires demonstrating that the employer's conduct fundamentally breaches trust and confidence. It's procedural, evidence-based, slow, and it changes relationships permanently. I asked myself a question that had nothing to do with ego. If I leave quietly now, what am I teaching myself about my boundaries? That question mattered more than compensation. For years, I had tolerated subtle diminishment because it was easier than confrontation, because I valued stability, because I believed competence would naturally protect me. But competence without boundaries invites exploitation. By Monday morning, my decision was clear. Though I hadn't spoken it aloud yet, I would not resign voluntarily, and I would not allow vague performance narratives to mature unchecked. But I also wouldn't confront emotionally. I would move structurally. When I arrived at the office that morning, nothing looked different. The coffee machine hummed, emails accumulated, colleagues discussed weekend plans. Daniel passed my desk and said, "Morning, Mila." "Morning," I replied evenly. There was no tension visible, no awareness that a line had been crossed on Friday. He likely assumed I was considering the offer privately, weighing comfort against pride. He didn't know I was weighing policy against conduct. That afternoon, I sent a concise email. Following our recent discussion, I confirm that I do not wish to explore resignation or exit options. I remain committed to fulfilling my role. If there are specific performance concerns, I welcome formal clarification in line with company policy so I can address them constructively. Polite, neutral, firm. That email did two things. First, it declined the soft exit without hostility. Second, it anchored the conversation to a formal process. His response came later that evening. "Understood. Let's continue focusing on development." Development. The word had become almost abstract. Over the next 2 weeks, the atmosphere subtly tightened. More check-ins, more scrutiny of minor details, more emphasis on visibility. I remained consistent. I asked for written objectives. I requested measurable targets. I summarized meetings. And then something predictable happened. A draft performance improvement plan was scheduled for review. The document arrived the morning of the meeting. It contained generalized statements. Needs to demonstrate proactive leadership presence. Should enhance stakeholder perception. Must align more visibly with management direction. No missed deadlines, no audit failures, no measurable deficiencies. Just impressions. I read it slowly. Then I compared it to 5 years of documented praise. The contrast was stark. That was the moment the decision solidified into action. Because a vague improvement plan, without documented performance failure, following the suggestion of resignation within a pattern of role diminution, is not development. That is pressure architecture. I didn't argue in the meeting. I asked for clarification on metrics. I asked how presence would be objectively measured. I asked what specific incident triggered the plan. The answers remained fluid. Afterward, I went home and reviewed everything chronologically. And for the first time, I said it to myself clearly. This environment is being made untenable. That phrase matters legally, but it mattered emotionally too. Because I wasn't reacting to a single comment. I was responding to a constructed pattern. The next step would be irreversible. Not loud, not explosive, but definitive. And I was ready to take it. Once the decision was made, everything became quieter.
Some avoided eye contact. Others wore expressions of polite discomfort. No one intervened.
Internally, there's a particular calm that comes when you stop hoping a situation will improve and start preparing for its conclusion. I contacted my solicitor again and sent the full timeline, emails, performance reviews, the resignation suggestion, the vague performance improvement plan, workload comparisons, and meeting summaries. He responded with a single line first. "You've documented this exceptionally well." That sentence didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me feel validated. We discussed thresholds. Constructive dismissal requires a fundamental breach of trust and confidence. It requires that the employee resign in response to that breach. Not months later, not ambiguously, but clearly tied to conduct. Timing mattered. Language mattered. Restraint mattered. Continue engaging professionally, he advised. Do not refuse reasonable duties, but if pressure escalates or the plan becomes punitive without foundation, we prepare to act. So I continued exactly as before. I met deadlines. I attended check-ins. I asked for measurable criteria in writing. But now, every interaction was filtered through one question. Is this building the record? 2 weeks into the performance improvement plan, something shifted again. Daniel began copying HR into nearly every exchange. He started framing minor stylistic differences as non-alignment with leadership direction. In one meeting, he said, "Your tone in stakeholder updates sometimes reads overly procedural." Overly procedural. I wrote that down. "Could you provide an example?" I asked calmly. "It's more of a general impression." General impressions had become the foundation of everything. Then came the email that clarified the trajectory. If measurable improvement isn't observed within the next review cycle, it read, we may need to reassess role suitability. Role suitability, not misconduct, not performance failure. Suitability. I forwarded the email to my solicitor. His response was brief. This is sufficient escalation. If you choose to resign citing breach of trust and constructive dismissal, the chronology supports it. I didn't act immediately. I waited 3 days, not out of hesitation, but to ensure emotional neutrality. During those 3 days, I continued performing flawlessly. No missed deliverables, no visible distress, no confrontations. On the 4th morning, I drafted my resignation letter. It was 1 page. It referenced the timeline of events, sudden performance concerns without prior documentation, suggestion of resignation, vague improvement plan, lacking measurable criteria, an ongoing implication of role unsuitability despite a historical record of strong performance. and it stated clearly, I consider the conduct outlined above to constitute a fundamental breach of mutual trust and confidence. As such, I resign with immediate effect and intend to pursue a claim of constructive dismissal. No accusations, no emotional language, just structure. Before sending it, I reviewed every word with my solicitor. Then, at 9:12 a.m., I emailed it to Daniel and HR simultaneously. The office around me functioned normally. Phones rang, keyboards clicked. No one knew that a structural shift had just been triggered. Within 40 minutes, HR requested an urgent meeting. Daniel did not respond directly. That silence was different from mine. It felt reactive. By early afternoon, I was informed that the matter would be escalated internally to legal for review before any processing of resignation paperwork. Legal stepped in before he could finish the paperwork. That sentence carried weight because it meant the company recognized risk, not emotional risk, procedural risk. I packed my notebook into my bag at the end of that day. Not dramatically, not in front of anyone. I didn't clear my desk yet. HR had instructed me to await guidance. As I walked out of the building, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. For months, silence had been interpreted as weakness. Now silence had become documentation, and documentation had become leverage. The consequences hadn't fully surfaced yet, but they were beginning. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't erupt through the office with whispers or speculation, at least not immediately. It began with absence. The morning after I submitted my resignation citing constructive dismissal, my system access was suspended, pending review. HR framed it as procedural neutrality. I was asked not to attend meetings until legal completed an internal assessment, which meant, practically, that the operations coordinator who had quietly held together cross-department workflows was no longer present. By the end of that first week, I began receiving messages, not from leadership, from colleagues. Quick question: where's the compliance tracker stored? Do you have the updated audit timeline? Daniel mentioned you'd know how to reconcile the Q2 backlog figures. I responded carefully. I'm currently not authorized to access systems. Please contact Daniel for operational continuity. That phrase, operational continuity, was deliberate, because continuity had always been my domain. And suddenly, it wasn't seamless. Within 10 days, the consequences surfaced structurally. A compliance deadline was nearly missed. 2 reporting discrepancies surfaced in the executive summary. A cross-team initiative stalled because the documentation roadmap hadn't been fully understood. None of this was sabotage. I had left detailed handover notes in shared folders. I had maintained clear file structures. I had built systems that were accessible. But systems require familiarity, and familiarity had been concentrated in one person, me. I heard through a former colleague, discreetly, that leadership meetings had become tense. Questions were being asked. Why did this escalate legally? Were proper performance procedures followed? Was resignation suggested prematurely? Daniel, I was told, maintained that it had been a mutual development conversation that, unfortunately, spiraled, as if gravity had acted independently. But gravity follows force. Meanwhile, I remained still. Still. I didn't post cryptic updates on social media. I didn't message colleagues with explanations. I didn't attempt to control the narrative informally. I allowed the process to unfold through legal channels. HR contacted me formally within 2 weeks. They acknowledged receipt of my claim and requested a settlement discussion prior to tribunal escalation. The language had shifted. No more development, no more visibility concerns. Now it was a risk assessment. From what I later understood, internal legal had reviewed the timeline, the resignation suggestion without a formal basis, the vague performance improvement plan, the expansion of duties without a title adjustment, and the absence of documented deficiencies preceding escalation. And they saw exposure, not moral failure, procedural exposure. Inside the company, the subtle realization began to settle. The steady backbone had not been passive, the quiet employee had not been unaware, and the documentation that had seemed excessive was now central. I was told, again through careful channels, that Daniel had been asked to produce specific examples justifying the performance improvement plan. He struggled, not because he had no opinions, but opinions had never been structured into measurable performance failures. Impressions don't hold weight in legal review. Patterns do. For the first time, I allowed myself to reflect on the irony. For years, I had been praised for documentation discipline. Now that discipline was shaping the outcome. I didn't feel satisfaction at his discomfort. That surprised me. I felt something else. Relief. Relief that I had not internalized the narrative. Relief that I had not resigned quietly under suggestion. Relief that my calm had not been mistaken, at least not permanently, for compliance. The consequences were still unfolding. Settlement discussions were scheduled. Internal reviews were ongoing. And somewhere inside that building, people were recalibrating how they perceived the woman who used to sit at the desk near the window, quietly taking notes. They were beginning to understand that silence does not equal surrender. And once that understanding arrives, dynamics shift permanently. The first settlement meeting was polite, politeness is often the final layer before admission. HR joined with an external legal representative on the company's side. Daniel was present, but quieter than I had ever seen him. No performance language, no development framing, just measured tone and procedural caution. They asked whether I would consider resolving the matter confidentially. I responded that I was open to discussion, provided the terms reflected both financial and reputational impact. There was a long pause after I said reputational, because constructive dismissal is not simply about money. It's about acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement is structured in legal phrasing rather than emotional apology. Over the next week, internal panic became more visible, though still controlled. I learned later that compliance had flagged inconsistencies in documentation related to my performance improvement plan timeline. Dates didn't align cleanly. Informal feedback sessions had never been formally recorded. The resignation suggestion lacked documented precursor steps. In isolation, each misstep might have been defensible. Together, they formed a pattern. That pattern was now being examined by people trained to look for liability. Daniel attempted to reposition the narrative during the meeting. It was never my intention to pressure, he said carefully. I was offering flexibility. Flexibility? I didn't argue. I responded evenly. When resignation is suggested absent documented performance failure, particularly after role diminution and increased scrutiny, it creates perceived pressure. Perceived pressure. Language matters. No raised voices, no accusations, just terminology. The company's legal representative asked pointed questions. Why was no measurable objective included in the improvement plan? Why was the employee excluded from strategic meetings relevant to her function? Why was resignation suggested prior to formal review completion? Each question narrowed the room slightly. You could feel it. Not hostility, containment. At one point, Daniel said quietly, if there was miscommunication, we could revisit the plan. Reinstate. That word arrived too late. Because once trust is structurally breached, reinstatement isn't a repair. It's optics. I responded simply. The environment had already become untenable. That phrase carried weight. Untenable does not mean uncomfortable. It means unsustainable due to a breach of mutual trust. After the meeting, they requested time to review settlement parameters. Within days, a revised offer arrived. Higher compensation. Neutral reference wording pre-approved. The confidentiality clause is mutual, not unilateral. The tone had shifted from defensive to corrective. Inside the company, I was told morale had subtly dipped. Not dramatically, not rebelliously, but employees had noticed the escalation to legal. They had noticed my absence. And they had begun asking quiet questions about process fairness. That's the thing about pressure architecture. When it fails, it exposes the structure behind it. Daniel, I later learned, was reassigned to a different division during the review period. Officially, it was described as organizational realignment. Realignment. Corporate language is endlessly adaptable, but internally, leadership had to acknowledge something. The situation could not be reversed. The paperwork had already been filed, legal had already stepped in, the chronology had already been preserved. By the time they considered repair, the structural breach was documented, and documentation doesn't dissolve with an apology. In our final meeting, Daniel looked at me differently. Not angrily, not even resentfully, just recalibrated. I didn't realize you were viewing it that way, he said quietly. That sentence lingered, because the truth was, he hadn't realized at all. He hadn't realized that a suggestion can feel like coercion when layered over diminishing authority. He hadn't realized that vague performance language can become weaponized. He hadn't realized that the quiet employee at the edge of meetings was building a timeline, and by the time realization arrived, it was too late to fix it. Our final in-person meeting was not scheduled as a confrontation. It was framed as a closure discussion. The settlement terms had been agreed in principle. The legal language was being finalized. This meeting, HR said, was optional. I chose to attend, not for argument, not for validation, for symmetry. The room felt different from the earlier sessions. Smaller, somehow. Daniel sat across from me, no longer leading the conversation. HR remained present, but mostly silent. There was no audience. Mutts. Just quiet. Daniel began. I want to say, he said carefully, that none of this was personal. I nodded once. I understand. And I did. That was the complicated truth. It hadn't been personal. It had been structural. He had seen me as adaptable, as unlikely to resist, as someone who would choose ease over escalation. He hadn't targeted me emotionally. He had assessed risk and miscalculated. I thought I was giving you options, he continued, an opportunity to transition without formal consequences. I'm sure that was your intention, I replied evenly, but intention doesn't cancel impact. There was no accusation in my tone, just clarity. He leaned back slightly, absorbing that. What would you have preferred? He asked. It wasn't defensive. It sounded almost analytical. Specific feedback tied to measurable objectives, I said. Inclusion in discussions affecting my scope. Clear documentation before escalation. and no suggestion of resignation absent formal process. He exhaled slowly. When you started documenting everything, he said, almost to himself, I should have recognized that something had shifted. I didn't respond immediately, because that observation revealed more than he likely intended. Yes, I said finally. It had. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was reflective. For the first time, we weren't speaking in managerial language or HR framing. We were speaking in cause and effect. He looked at me steadily. I underestimated how you would respond. There it was. Not an apology, not quite, but acknowledgement. I don't respond loudly, I said. I respond structurally. That sentence seemed to settle in the room. HR shifted slightly, but didn't interrupt. Daniel nodded once. I see that now. And that was enough. No raised voices, no dramatic declarations, no moral superiority, just recalibration. Before leaving, he said quietly, I hope this doesn't define your career. It won't, I replied, because the confrontation had never been about ego or winning. It had been about the boundary. When I stood to leave, I felt something surprising again. Not triumph, not vindication. Closure. Not the emotional kind, the structural kind. The paperwork would be finalized within days. Compensation would be transferred. Reference letters would be issued under agreed wording. Externally, it would appear as a negotiated departure. Internally, it had been a recalibration of power. As I walked out of that building for the last time, I wasn't looking back to see if anyone watched. I wasn't wondering what rumors circulated. I was thinking about something much simpler. For years, I had believed that being steady meant absorbing. Now I understand something different. Steadiness can also mean holding a line so precisely that the other person feels it only when they cross it. And once crossed, there is no heat required, only consequence. It's been a year. I don't measure time by the settlement date or the transfer confirmation. I measure it by the absence of tightness in my chest on Sunday evenings. I now work as an operations strategy lead for a smaller firm, one that values documentation not as quiet labor, but as infrastructure. The role is more visible. The expectations are explicit. The feedback is measurable. And interestingly, I speak no louder than I did before. My tone hasn't changed. My posture hasn't changed. What changed is internal. Before, I believed competence would protect me. Now, I understand that competence requires boundaries to be sustainable. I no longer volunteer for invisible labor without defining the scope. I no longer accept vague critiques without requesting measurable criteria. I no longer interpret a suggestion as neutral when it carries a structural consequence. There's a subtle difference in how I move through meetings now. When someone speaks over me, I don't shrink or smile reflexively. I wait, then finish my sentence, calmly. When expectations shift mid-project, I ask, can we document that change so we're aligned? Not defensively, naturally, because alignment isn't conflict. It's clarity, and clarity protects everyone, not just me. The experience didn't make me bitter. That surprised some people. Friends expected anger, a dramatic retelling, a villain in the narrative. But real power struggles in professional spaces rarely involve villains. They involve assumptions. Daniel assumed I would prioritize comfort over structure. Leadership assumed I would accept narrative shifts quietly. I assumed merit would naturally align with recognition. We were all wrong in different ways. What I carry forward isn't resentment. It's precision. Precision in communication, precision in expectation, precision in response. I also carry something more personal. Growing up, I was often described as the easy one, the child who didn't argue, the employee who didn't push back, the person who could be counted on not to cause disruption. That identity followed me longer than I realized. For years, I equated calm with accommodation. Now I equate calm with control. There's a difference. Control doesn't require volume. It requires awareness of leverage. And leverage isn't loud. It's documented. Occasionally, I think about that final meeting. At that moment, Daniel said he underestimated how I would respond. I don't replay it with satisfaction. I replay it as confirmation. Confirmation that quiet doesn't mean incapable, that patience doesn't mean passive, that softness doesn't mean surrender. Most importantly, I no longer fear being perceived as too procedural, because procedural saved me. Structure gave me language when emotion would have been dismissed. Policy gave me a footing when perception was being shaped. Documentation turned ambiguity into clarity, and clarity changed everything. If there's one shift that defines who I am now, it's this. I no longer wait for someone to recognize my value before I protect it. Protection doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like a timestamp, a saved email, a measured question in a quiet room. I am still steady, but now my steadiness has edges. If you've listened this far, you might have expected a louder ending. A dramatic reveal, an apology on record, a public reckoning. But that's not how most professional reversals happen. They happen in documents, in timestamps, in rooms where voices remain controlled and language becomes exact. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about interpretation, about how easily calm can be mistaken for compliance, how easily competence can be mistaken for convenience, how easily development can mask displacement when the structure isn't respected. I didn't win because I out-argued someone. I didn't win because I exposed a villain. I moved carefully. I documented consistently. And when the line was crossed, I responded structurally, not emotionally. That's the quiet dominance most people overlook. Not power that humiliates, power that holds. If there's a lesson in this, it's simple. Patience is not permission. Silence is not surrender. And professionalism does not require self-erasure. If you ever feel the narrative around you shifting without clarity, pause. Start documenting. Ask for measurable criteria. Anchor conversations to the process. You don't need to escalate loudly to protect yourself. You need to understand the framework better than the person misusing it. And sometimes the most powerful sentence you can write is one that begins with, "For clarity, I'll leave you with this question. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that your calm was being interpreted as compliance? And what would you do differently now?" I read every comment.